A Navy K-9 named Ghost was lying abandoned on the side of a highway when Sara Cole, a broke 2-4-year-old veteran with $63 to her name, found him. 2 hours later, she spent 5 of those dollars on a pile of rubble. Underneath it was a secret that would change everything. Hit subscribe, you won't want to miss this one. The Honda Civic made a sound like a cough, then a rattle, then nothing at all. Sara Cole guided it to the gravel shoulder of Route 9 without panic, without cursing, without the kind of white-knuckled drama that most people would have brought to the moment. She just let the wheel go light in her hands and coasted to a stop the way she'd been taught to handle situations that had already decided their own outcome. The engine warning light had been glowing amber since Tulsa. She'd noted it, assessed it, filed it under manageable. Turns out it wasn't. She sat with her hands flat on the wheel for exactly 30 seconds. An old habit, the kind that kept you from making fast decisions in slow emergencies, then unbuckled, reached into the back seat for her pack, and stepped out into the Oklahoma afternoon. The air smelled like dry grass and distant rain that wasn't coming. Flat farm country stretched in every direction, the kind of landscape that doesn't apologize for having nothing to offer. She locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing left inside worth stealing, shouldered the pack, and started walking. That was the thing about Sara Cole at 24. She didn't stand still and wait for situations to change. She'd spent 4 years learning that the ground beneath you was never as stable as it looked, and that the only reliable response to instability was forward movement. She'd enlisted at 19 out of a group home in Lawton, Oklahoma, aged out of the foster system with a duffel bag and a high school diploma, and the particular brand of self-reliance that gets built in places where no one is reliably coming to help you. 4 years in the Navy, attached to a SEAL support unit, running logistics and communications in environments that had a habit of becoming genuinely dangerous. She'd been good at it. Good enough that when things went wrong, really wrong, the kind of wrong that gets 3 people killed and 1 court-martialed, she'd trusted the process, filed the report, told the truth to the review board, then spent the next 14 months and every dollar she'd saved hiring a lawyer to fight for her team leader, a man named Marcus Webb, who'd made the right call under impossible circumstances and been handed a dishonorable discharge for it. The case was decided 6 weeks ago. They lost. Sara had walked out of the courthouse in Jacksonville with $63, a tactical backpack, and a small olive green tin that had belonged to her grandmother Jean Needles. Thread, a thimble, a measuring tape, and a photograph of Jean tucked inside the lid. It was the only thing she hadn't sold, pawned, or left behind. She hadn't gone back to her unit's network, hadn't called the guys who'd supported her through the case. Half of them thought she'd done the right thing. The other half thought she'd broken the team. She didn't want to sort out which was which right now. She didn't want to ask anyone for anything right now. So she'd driven west on Route 9 with no particular destination, just the vague and stubborn instinct that forward was better than still, until the car made its coughing sound and decided the question for her. The sign said Harlow 2 miles. She'd never heard of it. She walked. She found Ghost about a mile in on the right shoulder, half hidden in the dry grass. Her first read was bad. The animal was down, not moving, ribs showing through pale fur. She approached the way she'd been trained to approach anything potentially dangerous, slow, deliberate, no sudden movement, full assessment before contact. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, pale grey and white, and as she crouched down, she saw the collar. Military issue. She turned the tag. K9. Unit Ghost, USN, retired 2021, same branch. She looked at the pads of the dog's feet, worn and calloused, in the pattern that came from years of working terrain, not from living in a yard. This animal had logged serious miles in service. It hadn't been abandoned because it failed. It had been cut loose when the program's budget got trimmed, and the people who made those decisions never had to look the dog in the eye when they did it. Ghost opened his eyes and looked at her. No aggression, no pleading, just a long, steady assessment that she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror. Two people, one of them technically a dog, who'd been used well and let go badly, sizing each other up on the side of a road in the middle of Oklahoma. Sara opened her pack and found the half granola bar she'd been rationing since morning. She set it on the ground between them. Ghost waited a full 30 seconds before eating it. Then he tested his left front leg, found it acceptable, and fell into step behind her. She didn't invite him. She didn't need to. Harlow appeared slowly through the heat shimmer. A water tower, a church steeple 4 blocks of Main Street with a hardware store, and a diner, and a parking lot full of pickup trucks, arranged around a flatbed trailer where a man with a pros microphone was calling out lot numbers to a small crowd. A county surplus auction. Sara drifted closer because it was something to watch while she figured out her next move, and because Ghost had stopped at the edge of the crowd and was sitting perfectly still. Ears forward, looking toward the far end of the parking lot, with the focused attention of an animal that had noticed something worth noticing. She was still watching the dog when the auctioneer called Lot 12. Lot 12 was a half-acre on the east side of town, formerly the site of the municipal water tower, collapsed in the storm of 2015. The auctioneer described it with the particular tone of a man who already knew the Punchline Foundation debris chain-link fence on one hinge whatever wildlife had moved in since. Starting bid $5. Nobody moved. A few people in the crowd exchanged the kind of looks that pass between people who share a joke they don't need to say out loud. The auctioneer raised his gavel with theatrical patience. Ghost turned his head and looked directly at Sara. Not the lot, not the auctioneer, Sara. She would think about that later, the precision of it, the way the dog had oriented to her like a compass needle finding north at exactly the moment the decision needed to be made. She raised her hand. Every head in the crowd turned. She felt the weight of their attention, the way you feel weather coming, a shift in pressure, a change in temperature. A young woman with a military pack and road dust on her boots spying a pile of rubble. The auctioneer blinked, recovered, called for 10. Silence. His gavel came down. Sold, to the woman in the back. She signed the paperwork at the clerk's table, a folding card table set up beside the trailer and the clerk. A woman in her 60s, named Mrs. Farrow, took the $5 bill and began filling out the deed transfer. She was halfway through writing the buyer's name when she stopped. Her pen hovered. She looked up over her reading glasses with an expression Sara couldn't quite categorize. Cole, Mrs. Farrow said, and her voice had shifted into something quieter, like a person handling something fragile. I had a man call the county office. Must have been, 20 years ago, maybe a little more. He called several times over a few years asking about this particular parcel, whether it had been sold, whether it was still county property. She set down her pen. He sounded very tired. His name was Edward Cole. Sara stood very still. The noise of the auction continued behind her, another lot being called, another round of bidding, but it all went slightly distant the way sounds do when your brain decides something more important is happening. Edward Cole was her grandfather's name. A man she had never met, never spoken to, never been told much about beyond the fact that he existed somewhere in the family tree that had never quite assembled itself into anything she could hold on to. Did he say what he wanted with it? Sara asked. Mrs. Farrow shook her head slowly. Just asked if it was available. Said he had a connection to it. She picked up the pen again, finished writing. I always remembered the name because of the calls. He was very polite, very persistent. She folded the deed and handed it across the table. Well, it's yours now. Sara took the paper and walked east on Maple Street, with the deed in her jacket pocket and Ghost limping steadily at her left heel. And she had the strange, vertiginous feeling of a person who has just stepped onto a path that was already waiting for them. The lot was exactly as described, half an acre of weeds and gravel behind a rusted chain-link fence. The ruins of the collapsed tower scattered across it like the remains of something enormous that had simply given up. Twisted steel, broken concrete, a cylindrical tank lying on its side, half buried in the dirt. It was a wreck. But the fence provided privacy. The flat ground in the northwest corner, sheltered by what remained of a concrete wall, would hold a tarp. She'd slept in worse places. She'd slept in worse places for reasons that felt much less like choice. She dropped her pack inside the fence and began assessing the space with the methodical attention she'd been trained to bring to unfamiliar terrain. Entry points, sight lines, structural hazards, usable materials. Ghost did the same thing in his own language, moving the perimeter of the lot in a careful circuit, pausing at intervals, his nose working the air. He completed 2 full loops before settling near the gate, lying down with his head up and his body oriented toward the road. Guarding the approach, Sara set up her tarp with 2 chunks of concrete as anchors and ate the last of her food, a sleeve of crackers she'd had in the bottom of her pack since Kansas, and watched Ghost watch the fence line. She'd served with military working dogs before understood their training and their capabilities, but she'd never had one choose her. That was the word for it. He had chosen. On the 3rd morning, she found boot prints in the soft dirt near the northwest corner of the fence. Someone had stopped there, stood for a while, then left. Ghost had made a low sound around 3 a.m., the particular frequency she'd registered as cautionary, and then filed away as probably nothing. It wasn't nothing. The dog had been on watch and something had come and decided not to come closer. She adjusted her sleeping position. After that, placed her back to the concrete wall, kept the rebar within reach. On the 4th day, a pickup truck slowed on Tower Road, and a woman climbed out. Silver hair, cut short canvas apron, hands that told a story of decades spent gripping tools. She carried a water jug and a paper bag, and she walked through the open gate without hesitation. The way people move through spaces, they've decided they have a right to enter. She looked at the sorted rubble piles, the cleared foundation edge, the tarp shelter, and then at Sara, and her expression was careful and direct, and entirely free of pity. "You're the one who bought the water tower lot," she said. It wasn't a question. Diane Holt. "I own the hardware store on Main." She set the water jug down and opened the paper bag sandwiches from the diner, 2 of them. "You've been out here 4 days without running water. People notice." Sara looked at the food. She'd learned a long time ago that things given freely had a way of becoming things owed. And she'd spent the last 14 months burning through every resource she had on a case that ended badly enough to teach her caution all over again. Ghost stood up from his spot by the gate and walked over to Diane, slow and deliberate the way he moved when he was doing a full assessment. He circled once, stopped in front of her, and sat down. Then he looked back at Sara over his shoulder. Sara picked up the sandwich. "Thank you," she said. On the 9th morning, Ghost walked to the center of the cleared foundation, sat down, and stared at the ground. He didn't dig, didn't whine, just sat there with his full attention, aimed straight down with the particular stillness of an animal that has finished its search and is waiting for the humans to catch up. Sara had seen that posture before. It was called a passive alert. It meant he'd found something. She gave the ground the same attention she'd give a room she suspected was wired systematic. Patient hands and eyes working slowly across the surface before committing to anything. It took her 20 minutes to find it a seam in the concrete that ran in a deliberate line. Not a collapse fracture, not a settling crack, but a manufactured joint between 2 separately poured sections, sealed with something dark that had gone brittle with age. The edges were too clean. the angles too intentional. Someone had built this. She knocked on the left section. Hollow. She knocked on the right. Solid. Ghost sat 18 inches behind her left shoulder and did not move. She borrowed a pry bar from Diane's store that afternoon and came back the next morning. 2 hours of work, methodical and patient, leveraging sections loose piece by piece, the old sealant crumbling away in brown flakes. When the opening was finally wide enough, she shone her flashlight down into a chamber roughly 6 feet deep and 4 feet across. The walls poured concrete, smooth and dry, not a crack anywhere. Whoever had built this had understood waterproofing at a level that went beyond standard practice. This was the work of someone who expected it to last. At the bottom, resting on the dry floor, was a wooden box wrapped in dark oilcloth, secured with twine gone brittle. Sara lowered herself into the chamber. The air was mineral and old, and clean, the smell of a space that had been sealed against the world for decades. She lifted the box heavier than expected and climbed back out into the morning light. Ghost pushed his nose against it, immediately working every inch of it with focused attention. She sat cross-legged on the foundation and cut the twine with her pocket knife. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a wooden box with dovetailed corners and a hinged lid, dark walnut, carefully finished. She lifted the lid. 4 items packed with the deliberate care of someone who'd thought hard about what mattered. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with handling, a stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper, a bundle of papers tied with faded blue ribbon, and a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges, the handwriting on the front neat and precise. She almost reached for the envelope first. Then she saw the large folded sheet tucked along the inside of the lid, and her training redirected her hands before sentiment could. She unfolded it. A hand-drawn map, ink in red and black, densely annotated in the careful notation of a civil engineer from another era. It took her about 45 seconds to understand what she was looking at. A complete technical diagram of Harlow's underground water, pipe, network, depths, diameters, materials, junction points, every detail rendered, with the precision of someone who had built the system himself and trusted no one else to document it correctly. Her eyes moved to the northeast quadrant of the map, where a thick red line, the main supply conduit, ran directly beneath the section of Miller Road that the county public works crew had been marking with orange spray paint since Tuesday, getting ready to break ground on a utility expansion. She'd watched them work from a distance without understanding what she was seeing. Now she understood. If they dug without this map, they were going to hit that line. She set the map down carefully and picked up the journal. The first page. The handwriting was confident and unhurried, the hand of a person who believed what they wrote was worth preserving. Asterisk, Edward Cole. Civil engineer. Harlow, Oklahoma. April 1958. Asterisk. She read it twice. Then she looked at Ghost, who was sitting 3 feet away, watching her with the patient attention of an animal waiting to see if the human has finally understood the thing it has been trying to show them. Her grandfather had built this. She was sitting on it. He had come back. She didn't know when or how yet, but she knew from the sealed letter and the careful packing that someone had opened this chamber after the original sealing and added to it, and he had left everything he had for whoever came next. The photographs were still in their wax paper. The envelope was still sealed. She reached into the now empty box to set it aside, and Ghost stood up abruptly and walked over, nosed the inside of the box, and then scraped one paw firmly across the bottom, once deliberate, like a person pointing. Sara turned the box upside down. Taped to the underside, yellowed tape that gave way with a dry crack, was a small envelope. Inside, a property purchase receipt, dated March 1957, signed by Edward R. Cole for the parcel of land at the east end of Tower Road, Harlow, Oklahoma. Her grandfather had purchased the land privately before donating it to the town as the site for the municipal water project. The deed had his name on it first. Ghost had found the legal foundation of her ownership before she knew she needed it. She read the journal from front to back, sitting against the concrete wall with Ghost's head on her knee and the September sun moving across the sky above the open lot. Edward Cole had arrived in Harlow in the spring of 1958, hired as a civil engineer to design and build the town's first centralized water system. His first entries were technical and optimistic: pipe diameters, pump capacities, soil composition, the particular satisfaction of a man doing work he was born to do. He wrote about his wife Margaret, who brought him lunch at the work site and had opinions about everything. He wrote about their daughter Nora, 7 years old when they arrived in Harlow, who collected rocks from the construction trenches and kept them in a shoebox labeled "Important." By 1960, the system was running 18 months ahead of schedule, and the entries were full of the particular pride that comes from building something real that other people depend on. Clean water to every home in Harlow. He'd designed it, supervised it, and poured much of the concrete himself. Then, in 1962, a man named Douglas Vane entered the journal. Vane had money and land east of town and ambitions that required controlling the water supply. He approached the town council with investment proposals, political donations, and the kind of patient, systematic pressure that doesn't look like what it is until it's already worked. When Edward opposed him publicly and won the first 2 council votes, Vane shifted tactics. Letters to the county newspaper questioning the management of public funds. An anonymous complaint filed with the State Engineering Board. A petition signed by people whose names appeared on Vane's payroll records. The audit took 4 months and found nothing, every dollar accounted for, every decision documented in the meticulous records Edward had kept from day one. But 4 months was enough time for 3 council members to change their positions. In March of 1963, the council voted to restructure the Water Commission. They eliminated Edward's position and created a new one with a different title filled by a man Vane had recommended. Same job, different name, different person. Legal, technically. The entries from those final Harlow weeks were short and written hard, the pen pressed deep into the paper. He'd sealed the chamber. Packed the box. Left. Sara could feel the weight of it in the handwriting. Not despair exactly, but the particular gravity of a person who has understood that they cannot fix what has been done to them, only decide what to do next. She brought the journal to Diane's hardware store and set it on the counter without saying anything. Diane read the first page, set it down, and was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the back room and came out with a manila folder. Inside were photocopied pages from county records. Her father had collected years ago meeting minutes, property transfers, commission appointments, because he'd worked on Edward's crew and had never quite made peace with how things ended. She laid a page on the counter. August 1955, Edward Cole, appointed Water Commissioner by unanimous vote. March 1963, motion to restructure. Sponsored by council members Pruitt and Vane. Kellner Vane had sat on the council for 2 years before making his move. His grandson Preston Vane now ran the largest development company in the county. Diane looked at Sara steadily. My father always said something wasn't right about how Edward left, she said. He said your grandfather was the most honest man he'd ever worked for. She paused. The Vanes have had their hands in this town for 3 generations. Sara took the journal home and kept reading that night. Ghost warm against her side, the wood stove burning the last of the scrap lumber from the week's clearing. The back pages, written in a different ink, with a hand that had aged 40 years told the rest. Margaret had died in 1971. Nora had left home at 17 and never called. In 2005, a social worker from Ohio had found Edward through a hospital form. Nora had been killed in a car accident, leaving behind a 4-year-old daughter named Sara. Edward had filed for guardianship, been denied too old, too ill, too unstable. He had called the caseworker every month after that, asking for updates. He had sent things, a blanket, photographs, letters, not knowing if any of them arrived. Most of them hadn't. Sara set the journal down on her knee and pressed her palm flat against the floor, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her. She'd grown up believing no one had come looking, that the pattern was simple and permanent. People left, and no one came back. An 85-year-old man in Missouri had been fighting to bring her home, and she had never known. Mr. Stein at First National was a careful man who spread the 18 bonds across his desk one at a time and entered each figure into his calculator without hurry. He had the manner of a person who understood that numbers delivered correctly required a certain amount of ceremony. He checked his figures twice before he looked up. The combined matured value of the bonds was $55,240. Sara heard the number. She understood it intellectually, processed it, filed it, and then something in her chest unlocked that she hadn't realized was locked, and she said thank you, and shook his hand and walked out to Diane's truck in the parking lot and sat there with her hands in her lap for 15 minutes. She didn't cry right away. She sat with it first, the way you sit with something large and unwieldy before you figure out how to carry it. Edward Cole had saved that money on a civil engineer's salary in a small Oklahoma town in the late 1950s, $50 at a time, $100 at a time. And he had sealed it inside the foundation of the best work he'd ever done. And he had waited. He hadn't known Sara was coming. He couldn't have known. He'd addressed the letter to whoever carries the Cole name forward, and he had trusted that someone would. When she started crying, it came from somewhere deep and old, the kind of crying that empties something out rather than just expressing it. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and let it happen. Ghost from the back seat put his head over the gap between the seats and rested his chin on her shoulder. She drove back to find a black SUV parked inside the fence line and a man in a pressed blue shirt standing in the middle of her foundation. He was in his late 40s, grey at the temples, and he carried himself with the specific authority of someone who'd rarely been told no. He introduced himself as Preston Vane. She looked at his boots work, soled the tread pattern wide and blocky, the same pattern she'd seen in the dirt near the northwest corner 3 nights ago. He said the parcel had been improperly listed in the surplus auction, that it was earmarked in the 2019 commercial overlay plan, that he'd already been in contact with the county assessor's office. He said all of this in the measured tone of a person presenting information rather than making a threat which Sara recognized as a specific kind of threat. Ghost stood at her left knee, locking gaze with Preston, in that unblinking way that made people take an involuntary step backward without understanding why. Sara let Preston finish talking. Then she said, "The sale is clean. I've reviewed it with Mrs. Farrow." Preston looked at her for a long moment. "I'd encourage you to think carefully," he said. "This parcel has no utilities, no road access, no septic. You can't build here. I'm already building here," she said. He left without pressing further, which told her he was going to press through other channels, which told her she had some time before it became a formal problem. 3 days later, Ghost stood up from where he'd been lying in the afternoon sun and walked out the gate at a steady pace without looking back. Sara followed him 2 blocks east and 1 block south to a narrow lane behind the post office, where she found a boy of about 8 years old, sitting behind a green metal dumpster with his knees pulled to his chest. Not crying, but trembling in a way that suggested he'd been through crying and come out the other side. He didn't look up when she approached. Ghost walked directly to him, lowered himself to the ground, with his belly flat and his head down, tail moving in, slow sweeps the full submission posture. The one used to tell a frightened person that nothing in the immediate vicinity intended them harm. The boy's name was Lucas. His mother worked double shifts at the diner. He'd forgotten his key. He'd been there for 2 hours. Sara sat down on the pavement without speaking, not looking directly at him, the way you don't look directly at animals that are scared. And she took a granola bar from her jacket and put it on the ground between them. Lucas ate it. Ghost rested his head in the boy's lap. Sara sat with her back against the dumpster and understood for the first time in a long time the specific value of doing absolutely nothing except being present. She thought about the last time someone had asked her to just stay, really asked, without needing anything solved, and she hadn't. She stayed until Lucas's mother came running down the lane, still wearing her apron. She walked back to the lot and spent the next morning at the Public Works office, where she laid Edward's map on the supervisor's desk and pointed to the northeast quadrant. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called the crew foreman on Miller Road and told him to hold the dig. 2 hours later, she got a call back, confirming the pipe was exactly where Edward's map said. It was 8 inches deeper than the current utility records indicated, which would have made it invisible to standard ground-penetrating radar at the depth they'd been planning to dig. She didn't think about the implications for Vane Development's adjacent project until that evening, and when she did, she sat with it quietly for a while. Edward Cole's work had just saved the town he'd been driven out of. It had also almost certainly saved the project belonging to the grandson of the man who drove him out. Walt Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday with a metal toolbox that had been repainted twice and a level that Sara later learned was 40 years old and still accurate to 1/1000th of an inch. He was 70 years old with white hair under a canvas hat, and the kind of frame that had been large once and had settled into something more economical with age. He stood at the gate and looked at the cleared foundation and the rough lumber Sara had been stacking, according to a framing plan she'd sketched from memory of the field construction manual she'd used to build forward, operating posts in conditions considerably less forgiving than this. "I've been watching you work for 3 weeks, he said. "Most people quit by day 3. He set the toolbox down inside the fence. "I'm a carpenter. Retired. I've also been meaning to tell someone something for about 58 years, and I think you might be the right person." His name was Walt Pruitt. His father had been on Edward Cole's construction crew in 1958, had worked under him for 5 years, and had kept a handwritten journal of his own dates, conversations, names, figures, because he'd seen what was happening with Douglas Vane and had understood that someone should be recording it. Walt had the journal in a box in his garage. He'd been waiting for someone with the standing to use it. Sara looked at Ghost, who had walked to Walt's toolbox, sniffed it thoroughly, and sat down next to it, with an expression of clear approval. "Show me how to frame a corner post," she said. They started that afternoon. Walt was a patient teacher in the way of someone who had learned patience through practice rather than temperament, and Sara was a fast student in the way of someone whose survival had often depended on learning quickly and correctly. By the end of the first week, the skeleton of a 12 by 20-foot structure was standing on the north end of the foundation, plumb and square and solid. Walt measured it 3 times and said nothing which she'd learned was his version of high praise. The community arrived without announcement. Ray Decker at the lumberyard loaded her truck himself and told her his grandfather had drank good water from the system Edward Cole built, and that she should come back when she needed more. A plumber named Dave showed up one morning and ran a water line from the road connection, citing his teenager's need for community service hours with the particular sheepishness of a person inventing an excuse for generosity. The diner sent lunch 3 days running. Sara stood in the middle of it all and felt something she didn't have an easy word for. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, a slow adjustment to the possibility that the world might contain more people like Diane and Walt and Dave than like the council members who'd taken her grandfather's work and the officers who'd taken Marcus Webb's career. The hardest thing was letting it happen. Every impulse she'd developed across 24 years of being reliably let down pushed back against accepting help that had no visible strings. Ghost seemed to understand this about her. On the evenings when she sat too long in the silence of the half-built structure, turning things over in her mind, he would stand up, walk over and put his head in her lap with the matter-of-fact insistence of an animal that had decided physical contact was the correct intervention. It usually was. Diane brought a cardboard box one afternoon from the back room of her store, things Edward had left with her father when he'd left town in 1963, asking him to hold them. And the asking had turned into keeping, and the keeping had turned into forgetting, as things do across decades. When the box was opened, Ghost stood up from across the room and walked directly to it, his nose working with focused attention. He took out a folded handkerchief, pale blue, with a small monogram in one corner, EC, and carried it to Sara and placed it carefully in her hands. Then he went back to the box and sniffed it again, and looked at Sara and wagged his tail once. She held the handkerchief near him. Same response. She'd seen him smell the oilcloth from the buried box, with the same attention, the same confirmation response afterward. Ghost had never met Edward Cole, but he had memorized the scent signature from the objects in the foundation chamber, and he was telling her now with the certainty of a creature whose sensory memory was built on an architecture humans couldn't access, that these things came from the same person. Her grandfather's handkerchief, her grandfather's buried box. The same hands had touched both. She held the handkerchief carefully and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was held tight. The letter from Vane's attorney arrived, certified mail delivered to Diane's store, because Sara still had no mailbox. The language was formal and precise and said, between the lines, exactly what it meant. Preston Vane was filing a formal objection with the County Board of Supervisors, citing a commercial overlay designation in the 2019 Harlow Master Plan and what he characterized as a procedural irregularity in the surplus listing. A hearing had been scheduled. In the meantime, the letter advised her to refrain from any construction or modification of the property. Sara read it, standing in the morning sun with Ghost sitting at her feet, then folded it and put it in the folder with the deed and the biennial receipts and the photocopied council minutes from 1963. She'd been building the case file the same way she'd built operational briefs, chronological, sourced, cross-referenced, and she spent that evening going through it again, checking each element against the others, identifying gaps. The following Tuesday, at the regular town council meeting, Diane stood up during public comment and looked directly at Preston Vane, who was seated in the third row. Sara wasn't there. She heard about it afterward from 3 different people, each of whom described it the same way. Diane had stood at the microphone with her hands at her sides and said, "Edward Cole built this town's water system. Every faucet in Harlow works because of him. Douglas Vane, your grandfather, drove him out of here for it. Now you want to take the last piece of ground that family has left." She'd paused for a beat. "This town owes a debt to the Cole name, and it's past time we started paying it." She sat down. The room was quiet for several seconds. 2 days after that, Preston Vane came to the lot alone. No SUV, no lawyer, a pickup truck and work boots, and a quieter version of himself than Sara had seen before. He stood at the gate, and Ghost stood up at Sara's side and fixed him with that long, still regard that seemed to operate on a frequency just below threat, something more fundamental than aggression. Preston's jaw was working slightly the way jaws do when a person is organizing something difficult. "I want to make you an offer," he said. 25,000. Cash. You walk away with that plus whatever you recovered from the bonds. Sara looked at him. She thought about what $80,000 would mean, in practical terms, a real place to live. Time to figure out the next thing, the kind of breathing room she hadn't had in years. No, she said. He already knew about the map his site foreman had called him the same afternoon. Sara had gone to the public works office. He hadn't withdrawn the objection because he still believed he could win the parcel through the board map or no map. Something moved in Preston's face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, a person encountering resistance they'd underestimated. "Why?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Sara looked at the half-built structure behind her, at Ghost sitting patient in the afternoon, light at the foundation her grandfather had poured with his own hands. "Because he built this," she said, "and your grandfather took it from him. And I'm not going to let that happen twice." Preston stood there for a long moment, looking at something she couldn't identify, the foundation. Maybe, or something past it. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. That night, by the light of the wood stove, Sara found the back page entries she'd been saving. Edward's handwriting here was shaky and slow, the letters formed with care. A man in his 80s, writing things he needed to say correctly. In an entry from 2005, he wrote about the phone call from the Ohio social worker, about Sara, about the guardianship petition, and the denial and the monthly calls to the caseworker after that. The packages sent to a series of group home addresses, most of them never confirmed delivered. Then, in an entry from September 2009, he wrote that he was going back to Harlow. He knew the tower was probably gone. He knew the chamber had been sealed for 40 years, but he'd written a letter, the sealed one, still unopened in Sarah's kit bag, and he needed to add it to the box. He described prying open the foundation panel, placing the envelope, resealing everything. He wrote that he wasn't sure his heart would get him there and back, but that he needed to do it regardless, because if he couldn't give Sara anything else, he could at least give her the truth about where she came from. That was the last entry. Also in the box from Diane's back room, Sara found an envelope with a 1,999 postmark and a return to sender stamp, a letter Edward had written to Nora and sent to an address in Dayton that was already wrong by the time the envelope arrived. The letter her mother had never received. She set it on the floor beside her, unopened. Ghost pressed his head against her ribs and breathed steadily. There were things that needed to wait for the right moment. She was learning to recognize the difference between postponing and protecting. She arrived early and chose the seat on the right end of the third row, back to the wall, full sight line to both doors, and the table where the 5 board members would sit. 30 years from now, she'd probably still choose the seat with her back to the wall. Ghost sat at her left heel, his service tag visible on his collar, and nobody said anything because the particular bearing of a working military dog, still in its disciplined posture, tends to settle most objections before they're spoken. Preston was across the room with his attorney, a composed man in a grey suit, who'd clearly done this kind of hearing many times. Preston wore a sport coat and looked at the wall rather than at Sara. The body language of a person who has decided not to make eye contact as a matter of strategy. The board chair, Dr. Patricia Hale, called the session to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered procedural clarity a form of respect. Preston's attorney spoke for 18 minutes. He was precise and measured and built his argument with the care of someone laying bricks, the commercial overlay, the master plan designation, the procedural question about the surplus listing timeline. Everything he said was technically accurate, which was its own kind of dishonesty. Then it was Sara's turn. She walked to the front of the room and stood behind the podium and placed her folder on it. and the room settled into the particular quality of silence that happens when people sense they are about to hear something they won't be able to unhear. She'd briefed commanding officers in hostile environments. She'd testified before review boards while her hands were shaking and her voice had stayed flat. She knew how to take something that lived in the body, grief, anger, the specific exhaustion of fighting a system with your own resources until there was nothing left, and translate it into the kind of clear, sequenced presentation that people could follow and remember. She told them about Route 9 and the $5 bid and Mrs. Farrow's memory of a phone call from a man named Edward Cole. She told them about Ghost and the passive alert and the sealed chamber and the box. She held up the photograph of Edward standing in front of the tower's steel frame, young and lean and grinning, with the specific joy of a person whose work is going well. She laid the technical map on the board's table and pointed to the northeast quadrant and described the pipe that her grandfather's documentation had saved from the public works crew's excavation 2 weeks ago. She read 3 lines from the journal, the entry from March 1963 after the vote, and let the room feel the weight of the handwriting. When she described the back page entries, the phone call from the Ohio caseworker, the guardianship petition, the monthly calls that produced very little, she kept her voice level. She was telling the truth. The truth didn't need ornamentation. Walt Pruitt stood up when she finished, and he described what his father had documented and what he himself had witnessed as a child, and the journal he'd kept in a garage box for 58 years, waiting for the right moment. Diane stood. The public works supervisor stood. Mrs. Farrow stood last and said in her quiet, precise way that she had spoken to Edward Cole on the telephone multiple times over several years, and that he had never asked for anything except information, and that he had always said please and thank you, and that she had always found that remarkable given the circumstances. Preston's attorney had stopped writing in his legal pad sometime during Walt's testimony. Preston himself was looking at Edward's map, which was still on the board's table, with an expression Sara hadn't seen on him before, not anger, not calculation, but something that looked like recognition. He'd been looking for that map. His development team had been looking for it for months. The main supply conduit ran directly under the eastern boundary of the Vane commercial project currently breaking ground on Miller Road. Without the map, his crew was going to hit that pipe in approximately 10 days. The map his grandfather's manipulation had driven from this town was now the document preventing his own multi-million-dollar project from catastrophic failure. The board deliberated for 22 minutes and returned a unanimous decision. The surplus sale was valid. The commercial overlay designation was aspirational and non-binding. The objection was dismissed. Sara packed her folder with the same methodical care she'd brought to every step of this, and walked out into the October afternoon, with Ghost at her heel. And she stood in the parking lot for a moment, and breathed the cool air, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, because that would have required an opponent she'd wanted to defeat, and she hadn't wanted that. What she felt was something more like completion, like a circle that had been open for decades, finally finding its other end. She opened the sealed letter the night after the hearing, alone in the half-built structure, with the wood stove throwing orange light, and Ghost, a warm weight against her right leg. The paper was heavier than she'd expected, the kind that had been made to last. Edward's handwriting was the shakiest it had been anywhere in the journal. An old man writing carefully, one of the last things he'd ever put on paper. Asterisk. To whoever carries the Cole name forward. If you're reading this, you found your way here. You found the tower, or what's left of it. You found the chamber I built into this foundation when I was 38 years old, and still believed I could outsmart the people trying to take what I'd built. Asterisk. He wrote about the water system, and about Nora, and about the years in Missouri, the odd jobs, and the rented rooms, and the long inventory of losses. He wrote about the phone call from the social worker in 2005, about the guardianship petition and the denial and the understanding that there were things he could not fix, Only leave behind. Asterisk. I don't know who you are. Maybe you're Sara, my granddaughter. If you are, I want you to know I tried. I drove to Jefferson City twice. I wrote to the foster care board. I called every week for a year. They never let me through. If you're not Sara, if you're someone else who carries the name or someone who cared enough about this place to dig down and look, that's enough. You found your way here. The bonds are yours. The land is yours. Build something. Stay. Asterisk. She folded the letter and held it against her chest and sat very still. Ghost breathed steadily against her leg. She and Diane went to the county library the next morning and spent 90 minutes at the microfilm reader. They found it in the October 2009 edition of the Harlow Courier. 8 lines in the local section. Below a story about a new traffic light on Main. An unidentified man had been found deceased in his vehicle on Route 9, approximately 38 miles west of Harlow. Cardiac arrest. The vehicle was a 1998 Ford pickup registered to 1 Edward R. Cole of Springfield, Missouri. No next of kin located. He'd been 38 miles from Harlow. He had opened the chamber, placed the letter, resealed everything, and then he'd gotten back in his truck and driven west on the same road. Sara would drive east, 16 years later, and his heart had stopped 40 miles short of wherever he was going next. Diane put her hand on Sara's shoulder and kept it there. He made it far enough, she said quietly. He did what he came to do. 3 days after the hearing, Preston Vane came to the lot for the 4th time. And this time, something in the atmosphere was different from the first moment. The rigid forward tilt of his posture was gone. The careful neutrality of a person managing optics replaced by something less constructed. He stood inside the fence and looked at the rising frame of what would become the workshop and said that he owed her an apology, and that he was aware that an apology was structurally inadequate given the situation, and that he'd been carrying what his grandfather had done as a kind of private weight, since his father had explained it to him when he was 12 years old. Ghost walked to Preston, circled him once, and sat down 2 feet in front of him, looking up. Not guarding, not warning, just present, with that level attention that seemed to function as a kind of mirror. Preston looked down at the dog for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and laid a folder on the workbench. Inside were transfer documents for the building on Main Street that currently housed Vane Development's offices, the building that had been the Cole family home 60 years ago. Sara looked at the documents. She looked at Preston. "I don't want the building," she said. "I have what I need." She paused. "But your daughter is about 8 years old, and she doesn't know any of this yet. Tell her. Don't wait until she's grown. Tell her now, at the age when it becomes part of how she understands the world, rather than a thing she has to retroactively fit into it." Preston stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the framework of the workshop, the cleared foundation, the chain-link fence with wildflowers coming up through the gravel along the base of it. He said he would. Ghost stood up, walked to Sara's side and sat down against her leg. The transaction, whatever it was, had been completed. The workshop opened on the first Saturday of April. It wasn't much to look at. From the road, a steel-framed open structure built on the old foundation, the concrete her grandfather had poured. Serving now as the floor, the reclaimed steel from the tower's collapsed frame, repurposed into the load-bearing structure that held the corrugated metal roof. Walt's coffee maker sat between the belt sander and a jar of 16-penny nails. By 9 in the morning, there were 11 people working. A father and his teenage son building a bookshelf from plans Sara had sketched out. 2 women from a church group learning to cut dovetail joints with a patience that shamed her. A man named Ruiz restoring an antique rocking chair with the reverence of someone performing a sacred duty. Walt moved among them the way good teachers move, not hovering, not directing, available when needed and invisible otherwise. Sara stood in the doorway of her house, the 12 by 20-foot structure on the north end of the foundation. Plumb walls and a roof that didn't leak, and a wood stove that kept the whole space warm, and held her coffee and watched. She'd built most of it with her own hands. Every time she touched the door frame, she felt the grain of the wood she'd cut and shaped, and it felt different from anything else she'd ever touched, specific and permanent in a way that other things weren't. Ghost was on his bed beside the stove, with one eye open, monitoring the workshop traffic through the open door with the vigilance of a retired professional who couldn't quite turn it off, and she understood that about him completely. Cody arrived at 10:30. He was 17 thin in the way of someone who'd been rationing food for longer than a few days, with a backpack held together by a carabiner clip, and the carefully neutral expression Sara recognized as the default face of a person who had learned to reveal as little as possible in new situations, because new situations had a habit of going badly. He stood at the gate and looked at the workshop and the house, and Ghost doing the same calculus Sara had done outside the auction, assessing, pricing the risk of entry. Ghost lifted his head from his bed and looked across the yard at the boy. Then he stood up, walked to the gate, and lay down directly in front of Cody with his belly on the ground and his tail moving slowly. Full submission posture, telling the boy nothing here will hurt you. Cody looked at the dog for a long moment. His shoulders came down about a quarter inch. Sara crossed the yard. "You hungry?" He nodded once, barely. She took him inside and made 2 sandwiches and set them on the table with the directness and lack of ceremony that she'd come to understand was the correct approach, not fussing, not asking questions, not performing compassion in a way that required a response from someone too tired to perform anything back. She talked about the workshop instead, how it had come to be here, what they were building on Saturdays, how Walt had once glued his hand to a sawhorse, and they'd had to call Diane for acetone. Cody ate quickly, then more slowly, the rate of eating that marks the shift from survival urgency to something approaching presence. Ghost came inside and lay down under the table without being invited. After lunch, Sara showed Cody the hand plane. He picked it up with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used one before and ran it along a pine board in long, even strokes curling thin ribbons off the surface. She watched his hands. Steady, patient. The hands of a person who'd found a way to feel capable in situations where he didn't control much else. He'd been in 4 placements, he told her eventually, still looking at the wood. The last one had closed due to budget cuts. He'd been in a shelter in Greenville, then walking. She listened without filling the silences he left. She thought about Edward's letter, about the people who had shown up at this lot with water jugs and work gloves and lumber and explanations that were really just excuses for generosity, about Marcus Webb, who she still thought about on the hard nights, who was rebuilding something too, somewhere in Jacksonville without a foundation anyone had left him. About the specific math of inheritance, not the money, not the land, but the habit of showing up and not leaving. She had a spare room. 1 bed, 1 dresser, the stove warm enough to keep the whole house comfortable. She told Cody about it with the same matter-of-fact directness she'd been learning to receive from others. He looked at the table for a moment. "What if I mess something up?" "Then we fix it," she said. "That's what workshops are for." He moved in that afternoon. That evening, standing on the porch with Ghost heavy and warm against her boot, Sara took out the journal and opened it to the page she'd been looking at since the night she read the last entry. The inside front cover where Edward had written his name, and the date and the title of the work that had defined his life. Below it, In pencil, in the steady economical hand of a woman who'd learned precision from necessity, she wrote her own line. Asterisk. Sara Cole. Harlow Workshop. April 2025. Asterisk. She looked at the two lines for a while. Her grandfather's life compressed into one sentence. Hers. Just beginning. That October, Cody was standing at the workshop sink, washing his hands after class, when the gate opened and an older woman stepped through, hesitant in the way people are when they're not sure they're in the right place. Ghost looked up from the ground where he'd been lying in a patch of late sun, stood and walked to her at a pace that was neither guarded nor enthusiastic, measured, deliberate the way he moved. When he was doing a careful assessment, he sniffed her hands thoroughly and then walked back towards Sara and sat down, looking between the two of them with the patient expectancy of an animal awaiting a decision. Sara crossed the yard. The woman was perhaps 55, with the look of someone recently retired, and she was holding a padded envelope, the way you hold something that has been waiting a long time to be delivered. She'd been a carrier for Harlow's County Postal Service for 26 years. In 1999, a letter had come through her route, addressed to a woman in Dayton, Sara Cole, marked Return to Sender. She had not destroyed it the way she was supposed to. The return address was Springfield, Missouri. The sender's name was Edward Cole, the same name Mrs. Farrow had mentioned once at a county office, gathering the man who kept calling about the water tower lot. She had put the envelope in the keep box she kept at home, the one for things that felt too important to end in a bin, telling herself she would figure out what to do with it when she understood more of the story. She had thought about it over the years, particularly when she thought about the old man who'd called the county office asking about the water tower lot. When the workshop went up and the sign went out and she drove past it and saw the name Cole on the mailbox she'd helped Walt install last month. She understood. Ghost had been lying in the sun for 3 hours. He had smelled the old paper through the woman's bag, the same base scent signature that lived on the handkerchief, on the oilcloth, in the buried box, and had registered it and been patient about it the way he was patient about everything, waiting for Sara to come to him. She opened the envelope from 1,999 at the workbench, with Cody and Walt standing nearby, not crowding her, just present the way people are when they understand something important is happening. Edward's handwriting, late 70s, steadier than the final entries, still recognizably his. He wrote about Harlow, about the tower, about the years of moving south and working beneath his skill and carrying the weight of a system that had decided his honesty was a liability. He wrote that he was sorry he'd taken Nora away from the only home she'd known, and that he understood if she never forgave him for it, and that he hoped she was somewhere warm and safe with people who deserved her. The last paragraph was not addressed to Nora. Asterisk. If this letter finds someone other than my daughter, if someone else is reading these words, I want you to know that the Cole name stands for something. It stood for clean water in a town that needed it. It stood for honest work, done without shortcuts. Whatever drove us from that town could not take that from us. The foundation holds even when the tower falls. That's the thing about foundation work. You pour it right, you pour it deep, and it outlasts everything built on top of it. It outlasts the storms. It outlasts the people who try to take it. It waits. Asterisk. Sara set the letter down. Ghost put his head in her lap. Outside the last afternoon, light came sideways through the open face of the workshop and lit the sawdust in the air, and the tools on the pegboard, and the faces of the people working at the benches, Walt and Cody and the father and son, and the women with the dovetail joints, and Ruiz with his rocking chair. And it was the kind of light that doesn't last, but stays with you. The kind you can still see when you close your eyes years later. She thought about Route 9, and a dead car and a dog who chose her and a $5 deed, and everything that had followed from that chain of small decisions and circumstances, and the buried work of a man who'd trusted that someone would come. The foundation holds. She had stopped running. This was home. If this story hit different for you, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Tell me in the comments which moment got you the most, and where in the world are you watching this from right now?